Hey everybody, it's Melissa from Welcome to the Woods. This room that I am showing you right now is a bedroom on the main level of our home. Up until now, it's been used as my husband's office, and I've done very little to update it since we moved in. There are so many finishes in here that I want to get rid of and totally change. The only thing we've done is the flooring. I am going to transform this room into a bedroom for my 9-year-old daughter because we need to free up her bedroom upstairs as the new nursery. If you don't know, I mentioned in another video that I'm currently expecting a baby in August. So here are some clips of demolition I took down, window treatments, I took down all of the trim work, it's all going to be new, and I took out the drop ceiling. This video, it has a very special sponsor. WD-40's company 3-in-1 makes specialty lubricants and multipurpose oils that I'm going to be showcasing in this video. I feel like products like this are things DIYers use all the time, but a lot of times they don't get talked about how important they are to successfully DIY. So I'm going to show you some uses for that in this video. Now the drop ceiling grid was pretty difficult to take out. Obviously the tiles just popped up, but these were nailed with huge nails into the plaster ceiling joists, and I had to use a giant wrecking bar pressed against a piece of wood in order to pry them out. The metal rail along the walls that held the edge of the drop ceiling in place was extremely difficult to get out, and eventually I was able to do it by using a metal nippers. Now this nippers was extremely rusted tight, and so this was my first use for one of the 3-in-1 products. This penetrant lubricates and frees up rust on your tools so that they work just like new. I think I left this one maybe outside in the grass at one point, is why it got so bad. So once that tool was moving freely, I could easily use it to clip the metal edging and get it off the wall. When I removed the drop ceiling to expose the 9-foot ceilings in this room, the wall paneling that was on the wall did not extend all the way up. So I had to get inventive, and my idea was to use a level and mark an area that I wanted to cut off the wood paneling that was existing. I'm going to salvage the bottom half, and I'm going to turn it into kind of a wainscoting detail. I used my multi-tool there to cut this, and to be honest, the plaster behind this paneling kind of wrecked my multi-tool blades, so this was a very sucky process. This is where I'm at. So above the closet was also strange. It didn't extend to the ceiling. Clearly it was added later. But after all the demolition was done, this room is looking worse than ever. So now I'm going to finally start building back. I'm using 1x4 for trim work throughout this whole room. This is going to be sort of like a chair rail at the top of my wainscoting detail. And I'm also going to be using these 1x4s to install all of the window trim, door trim, and baseboards. Another big problem I ran into is that I had to run new wiring. The wiring that was existing in the room was just dangling above the drop ceiling and not inside the plaster ceiling. I decided to fish this wire by taping the old wire onto my new Romex and then pulling it through the wall. Clearly it had been fished in the first place, so none of it was secured to studs, and this actually worked pretty well to get new wire run through. Now I am cutting a hole in the ceiling. You can see I took out some of the plaster and I'm using my jigsaw to cut out the lath. Don't worry, I did know that there was nothing, like no wiring or anything above the ceiling, but if you're ever going to do something like this, it can be very dangerous. So make sure you know what's behind what you're cutting. I'm using a T-brace. I'm just showing a little pan of that because I had to basically put a receptacle where there was nothing before, and I couldn't access up there to secure it to the wall stud. So this T-brace is actually meant to hold many pounds. You can even put a ceiling fan on it. What it does is you stick it up in your little hole that you cut, and then you tighten it between the two studs. Here I'm trying to get my drill in to drill holes through the studs and put my wire up into like the ceiling area. This ended up being such a difficult task. You can see I had to knock out a huge area of plaster at the top of the wall there, and I was not successful drilling straight up into the ceiling. Again, lots of improvising here. Here you'll see me using a wire clothes hanger and again taping it to my Romex and then stringing that up through the little hole I drilled at the corner of the ceiling to get my wire into the joist cavity that I needed it to be in. I did end up having to knock a second hole in the ceiling plaster in order to fish that line because I could not reach from the edge of the wall to where I needed my receptacle to be in the middle of the room. Disclaimer here, I am definitely not an expert on any of this. My channel is a DIY channel, so you can attempt your own electrical stuff at your own risk. I was just kind of doing what I learned from my brother, who's an electrical engineer, as well as watching YouTube videos myself. So here you'll see that I finally got my wire, pulled the clothes hanger through, got the Romex in place. Awesome, awesome, awesome. So now I finally had enough wire to have my cord all the way up into the ceiling. It's going to all be behind the walls, and I'm going to have enough extra coming out to wire in a light fixture. You can see the relief and happiness on my face right there. This was definitely one of the hardest parts of figuring out how I was going to tackle this room makeover, was figuring out this electrical and how to get things secure behind the plaster. So now I'm putting in my little receptacle, and this mounts onto that T-brace I put up there. I also mounted the cord coming into it securely, and I cut it off with like 6-8 inches extra. And then I secured the Romex itself with, you know, the staple type things that you're supposed to put to hold your cord in place. I was able to secure the electrical wire in the ceiling joist system because of that second hole that I popped open. I got a hammer up in there. I was really happy about that. And I also secured it along all of the wall studs. At one point I did have the wire have to cross over a wall stud, and you'll see I installed these metal nail plates to cover it and protect it from damage. My plan for this room isn't really to patch plaster anywhere. I'm going to be covering pretty much everything, but the holes that I put in the ceiling did need to get patched to an extent because what I'm going to be covering all this crumbling ceiling plaster with is just like a wallpaper mural. So it's too flimsy to leave this hole as is. I chipped out enough plaster to put in like some plywood that was the correct thickness, kind of, you know, nailed that into the lath, and then used some mesh tape and did a simple plaster patch repair. This is probably not good enough for for like if I was going to try and make the ceiling visible and nice, but it was good enough for my plan. So you can see that I sprayed the plaster area where I put the mesh tape, and then I am patching with plaster of Paris and just a little putty knife. Cutting around that receptacle too was important because I don't want like there to be gaps when I install the light fixture. The crumbling plaster on the top half of the wall is going to be covered with yucca board, also called hardboard. It's basically an 1/8 inch thin material that's very heavy and very stable, although when you're carrying it, it feels kind of flimsy. So I cut this and ripped it all to size with my circular saw outside. And I'm using my workbench and a system of clamps and a straight edge in order to get all of this ripped down. It's very hard to rip sheet material that's this thin and large with any other method. With this yucca board kind of hoisted into place, I am able to have a flat looking wall, and all I have to worry about now are the seams where the yucca board meets. I'm just nailing this in with, again, small brad nails that are going to hit the lath behind the plaster. And of course I was careful not to hit my monstrosity of wiring hole that I created. So I had a lot of pieces of yucca board to cut, some of them sort of tricky and strange, like this piece around the window. But don't worry, because my seams will be forgiven by a lot of the trim work that I'm planning to do as this room comes together. For the strange space above the closet, I did consider making a storage area up there, but since it is 8 feet off the ground and this is going to be my daughter's room, it was just too enticing if I was going to make this accessible for her to play up there. So I decided to enclose it for safety purposes. Maybe in the future I'll use it as cupboard storage or something, but it's really pretty inaccessible. So what I did was I did as minimal framing as possible because all I'm going to have up as the wall is just that thin piece of yucca board. I screwed 2x2s into the ceiling and then one down the corner for the corner trim piece that's to come later, and then just nailed my yucca board to that. And voila, it's like it never existed. After the yucca board, it was time for my trim work again. The 1x4s I'm using are standard pine, and I was just very choosy in the lumber yard, but I am getting them to suck any warps and bows out by using finish nails and nailing them into wood only. So I'm finding all the wall studs to nail my trim work to. And then I'm filling all my nail holes on the trim with this drywall compound. And the reason that I'm doing this is because it sands perfectly smooth, and when you're using pine trim as your trim work, it's not going to look nice unless you do quite a bit of prep work. So for me, it's worth it to save the money. I love how this looks after my method of filling all of the nail holes and all of the pine knots with this joint compound, coming in and sanding everything. Of course, I caulked all of the seams for all of the trim work. This was especially important where my original like paneling that was on the wall met the trim work I did for the wainscoting, because cutting that paneling with the multi-tool, it didn't go so smoothly in some spots. Not only did I use my random orbital sander to sand all that trim work, but I also sanded any imperfections in the wall itself before priming. So the paint job that was in this room before was full of drips and imperfections, and I'm kind of a meticulous painter, which you know if you watch my last video, How to Paint Like a Pro. And so I did a ton of prep work in this room to get this ready to go. You'll notice in this shot too, the yucca board seam is filled with caulk and then drywall compound over it. For the bottom of the walls where the wainscoting detail is, I'm painting with a deep blue color. This is a beautiful color from Dutch Boy Paint. You can buy it at Menards, and it's in the color Seawater Blue. And then for the top, I just did a pure white in a semi-gloss. I chose a semi-gloss sheen so that I could just continue it onto my trim work, and all of my trim work as well as the top part of the walls would just be the same paint. I would have way less cutting in to do. I also used my painter's tape trick that I showed in my last video to get a very crisp paint line where the blue met the white trim work. Now for the edges of the room, I'm filling in these corner pieces of trim with my brad nailer, and I'm going to caulk and paint these as well. Along the ceiling, I did install crown molding, which was much more complicated than I realized it would be. So look for a video about how to install crown molding coming up in the future. I'm not going to give too many details away. As you can imagine, my miter saw got an excessive workout doing all the trim work in that room. So I want you to listen right now to what it sounded like. To stop the squeaking, I'm going to use the 3-in-1 all temp silicone because it works for even cold temperatures. Outside in Minnesota right now it's 30 degrees, and I could easily use this silicone lubricant to fix my squeaky miter saw without any worries. This worked like a charm, and any DIYer knows you gotta take care of your tools if you want them to last and do an accurate job for you. Now I'm gonna make you listen because there's no more squeak. Now the last thing to do in this room is to fix up this door. This is another area where the 3-in-1 lubricants really came in handy. So I took apart this door handle because I'm going to upgrade it with one of those darling little crystal ones. I think it's perfect for a little girl's room. I'm also going to be painting some of the hardware, but a lot of this was loud, creaky, and it didn't move smoothly because it's super old and probably a little rusted in there. The hinges also could use a little bit of love so that they swung a little smoother. So for this, I'm going to be using this multi-purpose oil from 3-in-1 because of its telescoping spout. So this is like the little spout on top extends and it allows you to get in really tight spaces like behind these hinges. And it was also very helpful for the latch and getting inside the keyhole area so that I could kind of lubricate inside like the handle mechanism itself. After some fresh paint on the hardware and my new crystal handles, this door got its own little glow up as well. So that was the finishing touch to this room. And what started out as basically me wanting to take out outdated finishes turned into a huge project that included covering plaster walls, a crash course in electric work, and the most finishing and trim work I have ever done. I'll share more about my crown molding and what I did with the ceiling in this room in future videos. I also have plans to build out the closet and totally transform it, as well as do an adorable little desk in the nook area between the window and closet. So look forward to some of those DIYs coming up over the next month. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope you were wowed with this room transformation. It was definitely a labor of love, and I cannot wait to see what my daughter thinks when the room is finally all done. If you loved this video, don't forget to subscribe to my channel so that you never miss what I'm up to. We'll catch you again next time on Welcome to the Woods.